Our gospel this Sunday is from Matthew chapter 16, and it's the passage where Jesus grants Peter the keys to the kingdom of heaven and establishes the Petrine office, the office of the papacy. And I want to talk about that in our video reflection today. And I'm not interested in so much doing an apologetic on the papacy. We're not going to be doing an exegesis over, this particular gospel passage. But I want to talk about the papacy in practical terms, in terms of its importance for Christian unity, because this is such an important aspect of being a Christian. Right, is unity with Christ. That's the whole reason why Christ became incarnate, was to unite us to God. And we are united to God through Christ by being united, first of all, to Christ, part of his body, right? And united with other members of Christ's body. And there's only one Jesus Christ. There's only one Christ who is head of the body. There's only one body of Christ. There's only one church. And so it really matters whether we're part of that church, that one church established by Christ. How do we know that we're part of that one church established by Christ? That's why the Petrine office, this office of Peter, is so important. And I do want to look at this gospel a little bit just to tease out just what Jesus is doing here when he gives Peter the keys, because there's some things that we might miss. We're limited by the fact that we're using an English translation, because there's limitations in the English language, specifically around the word you. See, we use the word you in both singular and plural. In most other languages, they have different yous, different words for a plural you or a singular you. So, including Southern English, where we say y'all, right? In Greek, they have singular you and plural you, which is the language the New Testament is written in. So, what Jesus is saying here, if we were to look at the Greek, he's talking to Peter, he's talking to Simon individually. He says, you are rock, you are Peter, singular you, and upon this rock I will build my church, and I will give you, singular you, the keys to the kingdom of heaven. And then he shifts to a plural you when he grants the authority to bind and loose. So he's giving all of the apostles together this authority to govern, but only Peter is he giving the keys. And that's significant, because what the keys represent is the office of the steward. And this is why the first reading for this Sunday is this passage from Isaiah, where a servant, Eliakim, is given the keys as a symbol of his office of stewardship in the kingdom of David. Right? He's not the king. He's not being named king, but he's given the authority to rule and to govern while the king is away. That's the authority of the steward. If you're familiar with Lord of the Rings, right? We have the stewards of Gondor. They ruled and governed while the king was absent. And this office was symbolized by the keys. And Jesus is using almost the exact same language that we find in Isaiah to establish this office in Peter. And that's an office that lives on through Peter's successors. Peter was the first bishop of Rome, and so all the bishops of Rome after Peter have held that apostolic office, that Petrine office. And this is very important when it comes to this question of Christian unity, because what would the church look like without this visible representation of Christ the head, without this one singular person who had the authority to govern in the name of the King, Christ our King? Well, here we're going to use the example of Orthodox Christians. And I'm not meaning to pick on the Orthodox by this at all. We love our Orthodox brothers and sisters. But if you're looking for what the Catholic Church might look like without the Pope, there's no better example than the Orthodox, right? Because like the Catholic Church, the Orthodox are apostolic churches. They have legitimate holy orders. They have legitimate sacraments. Their theology is in line with ours. The only thing that's really different about the Orthodox Christians is they don't recognize Petrine authority. They don't recognize that special role of the Bishop of Rome, and they're not in communion with the Bishop of Rome. And that question of communion is very important. And something that most Western Christians might not realize is there's actually no such thing as the Orthodox Church. There are multiple different Orthodox churches. I think it's something like 14. And that number is a little bit fluid, actually. You might look at different places online, different sources, and that number might be off by 1 or 2, because the heads of the several different Orthodox churches also don't always recognize communion with one another. Just like they're not in union with the Bishop of Rome, they might not be in union with some of the other heads of the Orthodox churches. And so you end up with a situation that looks kind of like this. If I drew dots on this board, I'm not sophisticated enough to do a little doodle video, so we're going to do the old-fashioned way with a whiteboard. If I drew dots on this whiteboard here, you might, and these, let's say these represent the different heads of some of the different Orthodox churches, you might have a situation where, the head of this Orthodox church recognizes communion with this one, and this one, and this one, but not with these two over here. He doesn't recognize them as legitimate churches. But this guy here, he recognizes communion. He's in communion with him, and him, but not with him or him, right? And meanwhile, this guy, he's in communion with him, and him, but not with him or him. And so the question of which churches are we actually in communion with, right? And this has practical aspects. If I'm a member of one of these churches and I'm attending a liturgy in one of these other places, one of these other jurisdictions, am I allowed to receive communion or not? Am I considered a member of the church or not? These are real practical questions, and they're of spiritual significance because, again, it's important that we are part of the body of Christ because there's only one body of Christ. And this was of significance to Jesus. Right? On the night before he died, his high priestly prayer that's recorded in John's gospel is that they may be one. He prayed to the Father that his followers be one, as you and I are one, Father, he prayed. So this was an important point for Christ himself and why he established that singular office of the Petrine ministry, that singular office represented by the keys as what we call the vicar of Christ, right? Which is another word for steward. It's one who has the authority to govern and speak on behalf of the king who is absent. Right? So what would this look like with the Pope? Well, we actually have this in the Catholic Church. And this lack of unity with the Orthodox, by the way, is one of the reasons why it's an obstacle for reunion between Orthodox and Catholics, because over the centuries, there have been ongoing talks, ongoing outreaches trying to reunify the Eastern Orthodox Christians with the Western Church. And one of the biggest problems is there's no one person who can speak on behalf of all of Eastern Christianity. And so the different dialogues and things are taking place with different bishops, different heads of churches. And some of them have come back, many of them have come back into union with the Bishop of Rome. And so something that a lot of Western Christians, again, don't appreciate is there are multiple Catholic churches, right? It's not just all the Roman Catholic Church. We belong in the West to the Latin Church, but there are multiple Eastern Catholic churches, and many of them are these former Orthodox that have come back into the Union of Rome. There's actually, I think, 23 different Catholic churches. And so we have a situation where we'll draw our little dots here representing the different heads, the different leaders, different bishops that lead these different churches. But now the difference is we have this office of Peter. We have this office of Peter. And if the head of this church is in communion with Peter, and the head of this church is in communion with Peter, and the head of this church, and the head of this church, if all of these churches are in communion with the successor of St. Peter, the Bishop of Rome, guess what? They're all in union with one another. They're all in union with one another. And there is no question of communion. Right? There's no question of communion. They are all united. And so as a member of the Roman Catholic Church, and I'm in union with the Bishop of Rome, if I'm attending a liturgy in any of these other Catholic churches that are also in the Bishop of Rome, I can receive those sacraments. I'm considered a brother. I'm united with them spiritually, even though it may be a different liturgical rite, right? We're part of the same body of Christ. And we know this because we have that Petrine office as a visible focal point of our unity. He's not head of the church. Jesus is the head of the church, but he is the visible representative of that head on earth to serve as that focal point for unity. Because without that visible representative of the head on earth, we're a church divided. That's just a fact. We're a church divided. The papacy gives us that focal point for unity in Jesus Christ, who is the source of that unity. So this has very practical applications in terms of the governments and the structure of the church. So that's what I wanted to say about the papacy. I think it's one of the misunderstood and maybe underappreciated aspects of that Petrine ministry, to be that visible source of the unity that Christ prayed for all of us. Praise be Jesus Christ.